Hello and welcome to Solo Psych. My name is Josh Rogers, and this channel is dedicated to the art and science of independent psychology. Our question for today: is it wrong to hurt myself? A seemingly simple and unnecessary question that I am going to argue is actually very complicated and unavoidable in our modern world. But first, let's ask a little bit easier of a question just to get on the same page a bit philosophically. So, true or false? People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. For our purposes today, this question is completely false. And in fact, the whole reason that we must address this issue on our own is that the many people that are trained and paid to do so are not doing a very good job, regardless of how much they care. So, for our purposes, the updated saying should be, smart people don't care how much you care until they know how much you know. With this in mind, we now turn to our featured psychologist and spiritual guide through today's topic, Mr. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, the man who philosophized with a sledgehammer. He's not well known for being overly careful or caring, but he certainly did seem to know a lot. He is also not commonly known as a psychologist. His official position was chair of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, which is basically the study of history and evolution of language. He was also an accomplished mountaineer and poet, and he is best known, of course, as a philosopher. I am a huge fan of Nietzsche, aka the sledgehammer, aka Zarathustra, and I'm convinced that the only reason he wasn't called a psychologist is because that science wasn't widely recognized at the time. Perhaps the same kind of reasoning that prevents us from confidently calling him a philologist today. Regardless, you don't have to make it very far into his incredibly insightful writings to realize that you are indeed dealing with a psychologist of the highest caliber. Dr. Sigmund Freud himself said that, quote, the degree of introspection achieved by Friedrich Nietzsche had never been achieved by anyone, nor is it ever likely to be achieved again. Whatever you want to call him, we will be dipping into the mind of this titan of Western thought regularly through this discussion, starting with one of my favorite quotes of his that is probably best understood as a warning. It is the business of the very few to be independent. It is a privilege of the strong. And whoever attempts it, even with the best right, but without being obliged to do so, proves that he is probably not only strong, but also daring beyond measure. This excerpt from his 8th book, Beyond Good and Evil, is a great way to set the tone for our first attempt at independent psychology. In the last half of it, we'll frame our conclusion once we get there. Nietzsche himself was extremely independent, being a lone atheist long before it was cool, and he is obviously very proud of his hard-won independence. He is also very clear that it is not for everyone. It is the business of the very few to be independent. It is a privilege of the strong. Nietzsche is so proud of his independence because he chose it for himself, and then made immense personal progress psychologically. Whoever attempts it, even with the best right, but without being obliged to do so, proves that he is not only strong, but also daring beyond measure. The difference for us is that independent psychology is no longer an option. It is certainly a huge risk to reject the thought patterns given to you through culture and conditioning, but the truth about our modern mindset is that it has become so dysfunctional and distressing that we really don't have a choice. We may not be especially strong or daring beyond measure, but depending on society for our mental health status is simply not a realistic option. We no longer have the luxury of choosing independence. We are now obliged. If you are beginning to understand what is meant by independent and are willing to accept the risk involved, considering that the risk of dependence is likely much higher, then we can now move on to a working definition of psychology and then proceed to apply it to our original question. Bonus points for any of you Nietzsche heads out there that remembers his childhood nickname given to him by his family. What is psychology? Psychology is many different things to many different people. For our purposes, we will use the simplest definition, which is psychology is the science of the obvious. Science meaning a method or process with rules and a goal. Psychology is not religion or philosophy, although both of these do have huge implications for psychology. Psychology is not concerned with the big metaphysical or supernatural questions of existence. Psychology refers to the human experience of adapting as a species and developing as individuals. This adaptation/development involves different stages and settings and plays out at both the personal and interpersonal levels. As unique individuals, we are able to think more analytically and critically in terms of absolutes and abstractions. As members of a group, we tend to process more intuitively and holistically in terms of symbolic patterns and cultural trends. Psychology overlaps both of these cognitive styles, and a good psychologist will bounce back and forth, creating connections and meaning. A good example of this, for our purposes, is the 1999 film Fight Club, one of my favorite movies and one that captures the essence of our question in a visual and narrative way. Is it wrong to hurt myself? If you have seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, then you should really see it. I'm not going to spoil it for you here. We'll be using other visual and narrative devices to address our question, as well as plenty of analytical argument. The analytical side will mostly rely on a recognition of the human tendency towards self-destruction, and a potential explanation using various forms and functions of said tendency. Then we will conclude with a plan of action, and a final word from the sledgehammer himself, Friedrich Nietzsche. Here's the official clinical definition of the concept we are going to be working with today. We are going to be calling this particular concept self-sabotage. We're actually saving self-handicapping for a much darker and more dysfunctional form that we'll get into later on. The clinical definition of the human tendency to undermine their own performance, consciously or otherwise, is what I call self-sabotage. The concept summarized by the Wikipedia article you just saw. We're going to blow through this one real quick because it's fairly straightforward and frankly we have bigger fish to fry. The basic reasoning is probably best understood as you can't fail if you don't try. We're all keenly aware of the enormous pressure this society puts on us to perform and succeed. What we aren't all aware of until now is that one way we tend to cope with that pressure is by resisting full commitment to the task at hand. That way, if we lose, we can always believe that we might have won if we would have given it 100%. If we somehow win, it seems even more impressive considering our partial effort. The best example of this that I know is the kid in school that would always party the night before a big test or game. He would brag about how wasted he got the night before and how hungover he was that day. And if he didn't perform well, which he usually didn't, he would just blame the hangover. This kind of coping mechanism really does help relieve the pressure of modern achievement culture, but the downsides are all too obvious. Failure may be less painful if you give yourself a plausible excuse, but it is also much more likely. This is the double-edged nature of psychological coping mechanisms. They actually work quite well, but only temporarily. Eventually, the chronic coper wakes up to the endless hangover of a life half wasted. In our example here is from the 2000s show Workaholic, about a group of hilarious 20-something slackers that probably wouldn't be as funny if they were in their 40s. And here is where things begin to get very dark and dysfunctional. Now is probably a good time to remember Nietzsche's warning about the risks of independence. You see, it turns out that we don't just self-sabotage to give ourselves excuses and protect our own egos, but we also do it to protect the egos of those around us that we love and depend on. Misery loves company, as the old saying goes, and no one knows how true this really is more than those of us that grew up poor. It turns out that the primary obstacle to escaping poverty is not the greedy government, or biased universities, or predatory big business, or any other type of systemic oppression. The real reason we stay poor is that all the other poor people around us, including friends and family, are often determined to keep us that way. It would just be far too embarrassing and lonely to be surpassed by their younger counterparts. And it's just a law of nature that destruction is much easier than creation or productivity. It is simply much easier to tear others down than to build yourself up. Another variable here is that it is much more painful to let someone down that you care about than someone you don't. So many poor kids aren't loved simply because their family would have to feel terrible about their situation if they were, and not because they are inherently unlovable. The best way to visualize this toxic dynamic, in my opinion, is through the bucket crab analogy. Maybe you've heard of it. It turns out, if you have a bucket full of crabs, you don't actually need a lid. This is because if any one crab reaches the edge to escape being cooked and eaten, the rest will cling on and claw it back down to the bottom with them. The important difference between crabs and humans, of course, is that humans have relationships with the other people clawing them back down. They understand and sympathize with their saboteurs, and will often accept and even participate in the sabotage as a result. This more specialized type of self-destruction we will call self-handicapping due to its prolonged and debilitating effects. Family structure plays an important role in the analysis of self-handicapping, especially in a modern setting. This is because parents exert much more influence on children now than perhaps any other time in human history, and each parent has different innate motivations and cultural incentives. There is one parent-child dynamic that most consistently leads to self-handicapping in the child. Due to our society's material wealth and emphasis on individual rights, children often spend their most formative years in relative isolation. Throughout human history, until about 5 minutes ago in evolutionary terms, human offspring grew up in a very broad community setting. Children would have been exposed to a wide range of people from both sexes and all age groups on a daily basis. Even their living quarters were likely shared with several members of their immediate and even extended family. As a result, they had a large sample size of their species to adapt their personalities to. It takes a village, as they say. Unlike the vast majority of life on Earth, all humans are born completely helpless and dependent, meaning they have only one real biological imperative: to make people love them. For the first and most critical years of development, human young's survival depends entirely on the people they depend on. And any youngsters that can't figure out how to win over the older people around them face an enormous risk of abandonment and death. This goes for one interpersonal relationship in particular. When children are attempting to endear themselves to a wide range of people, of both sexes and all age groups, they enjoy a very well-rounded development. This is because different traits and characteristics appeal to different people in their lives. Grandpa likes to crack jokes and poke fun at the weird uncle. Grandma likes to sing songs and tell stories. Dad likes to solve problems and fix things. Big cousins like to compete and test boundaries. But moms generally like one thing about us in particular. Children that grew up in modern society, with all its rooms and walls and individuality, spend a fraction of their formative years with a fraction of the human diversity they were designed for. In a culture where every child is considered the sole property of its mother, who is materially capable of raising it without the direct assistance of a father, or in any other family members for that matter, many of us grow up in an intensely unnatural isolation. Our same survival imperative stands: be loved. Now, We must only seek love from one person, who seems to be the most interested in one thing about us: dependence. Mothers are motivated by their maternal instincts to keep us as dependent as possible for as long as possible. These powerful instincts would traditionally be balanced by the instincts and opinions of other people in the tribe, particularly the fathers, that would be interested in demonstrations of independence and competence. The father is rewarded internally and externally for producing a strong, capable child. The mother is rewarded instinctively, socially, and sometimes even financially for producing a child that is disabled. Much in the same way that alcohol and other excuses provide relief from the pressure to perform in the short term, but end up ruining our lives in the long term, children that develop under the isolated influence of mothers and/or mother figures will enjoy a very comfortable and secure existence for a time. The problem, obviously, is that not everyone is going to find our infantile incapacity so endearing, especially not demanding bosses, coworkers, and prospective mates. What guarantees your survival in the very small bubble of your mom's house dooms you to a life of mediocrity and loneliness once you leave, if that ever even happens. The bottom line here is that health and competence are actually, strangely, maladaptive in the context of maternal dominance. If the adults in charge indulge in sympathy and codependence, then the children that they raise will automatically develop in ways that facilitate sympathy and codependence. Or, more accurately, they won't develop at all. In the words of Dr. Sigmund Freud, the good mother necessarily fails. The clinical term for physically self-handicapping in an attempt to garner sympathy and attention is Munchausen syndrome. And when it is inflicted on you, willingly or otherwise, it is called Munchausen's by proxy. I would argue that many, if not most, of the children raised in the modern West have been Munchausened, at least to some degree, either by their families, governments, big businesses, including food and medicine producers, and perhaps most severely by our educational institutions. Another reason that women are more comfortable keeping their children dependent is that they are more comfortable being dependent themselves. Just because women have been completely liberated in the context of modern society does not mean that their latent instincts have been freed from the greater context of human evolution. Traditionally speaking, women have been dependent on men, and it's worked out pretty well for them so far. This is one reason why they see no issue with keeping their own offspring dependent, including the males. The big problem now, that women are predominantly raising children on their own, a problem now playing out in real time, is who the new generation of mothers are going to depend on when there is no one around that is dependable. This type of selfishly indulgent motherhood is not necessarily a new phenomenon. The Greeks and later Freud would have called them Oedipal mothers. And all you Jungians out there in the shadows will likely recognize this archetype of the devouring mother. My example is the Kathy Bates character from the 1990 movie Misery, based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. Annie Wilkes, pictured here, is a lonely spinster that takes her favorite author into her home after he gets in a bad car wreck near her house, and promises to nurse him back to health. That is not what she does at all, spoiler alert. Instead, she breaks both his ankles so he can't leave, and makes him rewrite the ending of his last novel, according to her own taste. And speaking of sledgehammers, let's return now to our favorite psychologist with a quote. "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist." Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was independent, as we already established. He took many controversial positions that put him at odds with the cultural consensus of his time. His most controversial claim, that makes him the target of moral condemnation even today, was that, quote, "God is dead, and we have killed him." In one sense, Nietzsche was claiming that there is no objective structure to existence, no rational, mathematical, big T truth that undergirds and supersedes the subjective experience of our senses? This is a perplexing and intriguing claim that is nonetheless metaphysical in nature and therefore out of our purview as psychologists. You may choose to believe in an objective element of reality and/or consciousness, as I do, but we must now agree that it cannot be adequately explained or described, as any attempt to do so would be, by definition, subjective. Another quote: "Morality is the herd instinct in the individual." Another way to understand Nietzsche's declaration of deicide is in the sense that many believers would have taken it at the time, and since. That is, that there are no moral absolutes. Nietzsche was a philologist, a historian of language, and as such had an intimate understanding of the origins and evolution of the words that comprised and communicated the moral belief systems of his time. Words like sin, virtue, and God. He knew many, many different words in many different languages, and was able to trace these diverse symbols back to their common sources, all the way back to the instincts underneath them. He noticed that the common conception of justice, that is what most people meant by the word God, had evolved out of the human instinct of reciprocity or fairness, had been elevated to absolute status by an element of humanity that could not rely on any other instincts. He claimed that Christianity, the best example of what he called slave morality, used the idealized form of this common instinct to overthrow the more broadly instinctual and therefore better adapted members of the species. The ruling blonde beasts of Roman nobility, with their many gods representing many competing and collaborating instincts, were eventually overpowered, moralistically, by this one simpler and more far-reaching pair: good versus evil. Quote, "To have to fight instinct, that is the definition of decadence. As long as life is ascending, happiness equals instinct." This one ancient instinct, justice, when refined and idealized the way that Christ and his followers did it, was enough to outweigh and undermine all the other instincts combined. Instincts that early Christians, according to Nietzsche, were prevented from acting on anyway because of their slave status. He was vehemently anti-Christian, both because he found the assertion of an ultimate, universal sense of capital J justice insultingly implausible, but also because, like the noble blonde beasts that he descended from, he felt no desire to sacrifice his hard-earned and highly coherent instincts on its altar. Quote, "The Christian faith from the beginning is sacrifice, the sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of spirit. It is at the same time subjugation, self-derision, and self-mutilation." Christianity, for better or worse, is indeed the systemic celebration and indoctrination of self-sacrifice. This would be very hard for anyone to dispute. Whether that is ultimately a good thing or a bad thing largely depends on what you believe about the objective nature of existence, which is, again, not our department. However, whether it is good or bad in terms of everyday human experience is completely open to speculation for anyone sharing in that experience. Nietzsche would have lumped Christianity in with self-sabotage, self-handicapping, and both types of Munchausen's, if he had known the terms. He would have likely argued that a belief in an ultimate judge enforcing an absolute law that demanded complete self-sacrifice was the perfect spiritual, philosophical basis for self-sabotage in all its forms. And maybe he was right, personally. Maybe Christian self-sacrifice is an unnecessary burden for a highly educated adult and undisputed genius of philosophy. Maybe there are races of men that have balanced and synchronized their multitudes of instincts into a beautiful symphony. Perhaps there are advanced forms of consciousness, on this planet and elsewhere, that have no need of an objective frame of reference with which to organize and align their animalistic natures. But how could a mature and honest mind assert that self-sacrifice is objectively wrong for everyone, everywhere? Especially if they don't believe in the concepts of objective or wrong. Nietzsche denounced and despised Christianity for the same reason that many atheists do today. It is inherently anti-instinct. The deep and abiding sense of self-sacrifice that Christ introduced into the species creates an internal state of turmoil that is almost indescribably painful and confusing. In response to this painful confusion, it is completely understandable that some individuals that are exposed can't help but turn away. The initial realization that the world is profoundly unjust, as demonstrated by Christ's false accusation, humiliation, and slow, agonizing death, is a terrible shock to those of us that are particularly empathetic and imaginative. That said, the pain of this realization cannot ever be deemed unjust unless the critic themselves has some sort of new paradigm for making such definitions. It certainly won't be provided by Christianity in this case. There is no way for an atheist to claim that the psychological pain of a Christian conscience is ultimately wrong, unless they first provide their definition of wrong, in good faith. Pun intended. They can no longer rely on the Christian conception, tacitly or otherwise, once they have renounced the faith and rejected the ultimate judge. God is dead, remember. This is why Nietzsche's famous proclamation should not necessarily be considered a celebration or a taunt. Without the religious, supernatural conception of big T truth, we can't make any definitive claims about anything, not even Christianity itself. All we can say is that it is often painful, which it certainly is. And, like Nietzsche, if you are honest and mature, then you may have the right to say that it is wrong for you, assuming you have a working definition of wrong. But if you are basing your judgment on the pain of following Christ, then you have to acknowledge that your subjective experience does not necessarily reflect the objective nature of reality, or the historical development of humanity, or even the perspective of the most intelligent and influential atheist of the modern era, Mr. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Final quote, "That which does not kill me only makes me stronger." By now you have hopefully come to the realization that our original question was not entirely sincere. It was a trick question, a rhetorical device simply designed to lure you into clicking a link and reconsidering some deeply held beliefs. Hopefully you have noticed a pattern through our analysis of several forms of self-destructive behavior, namely that a psychologist is a scientist, and a scientist can't answer questions that can't be tested or falsified. Also, you have likely noticed that many elements of psychological coping mechanisms are similar to an alcoholic bender. They start out comforting and enjoyable, but ultimately come with a price. To this end, the Christian style of self-sacrifice is an almost exact reversal of our pattern. Self-sabotage and self-handicapping are both extremely common coping mechanisms that are so prevalent because they start out so comfortable and comforting. They are only wrong, scientifically, in that their comforting power is strictly limited to a highly specific context. Christian self-sacrifice is the anti-instinct that is quite uncomfortable for many people, which is a primary reason why it has been falling out of favor in the modern era. However, although it very likely enables much real self-destruction in other forms, self-sacrifice can't be easily understood in the same way that alcoholism or codependence can. And it can't be condemned in terms of a universal sense of justice either. These kind of moral claims don't make any sense when made from outside the moral framework of religion itself. The only real question that we can ask from a scientific perspective is whether or not self-sacrifice is healthy or adaptive, long-term. It would seem that at this point, what is needed is an intensive dissection of Christian self-sacrifice through the lens of independent psychology, which is exactly what we will do in the next video. In conclusion, we'll adjust our original question to one we have the right to answer. Is it healthy to self-sacrifice? And we will give Nietzsche the final word with the second half of his quote on independence. He enters into a labyrinth. He multiplies 1,000-fold the dangers which life in itself already brings with it, not the least of which is that no one can see how and where he loses his way, becomes isolated, and is torn piecemeal by some minotaur of conscience. Supposing such a one comes to grief, it is so far from the comprehension of men that they can neither feel it nor sympathize with it. And he cannot any longer go back. He cannot even go back again to the sympathy of men. And for all the other Nietzsche fans out there, his childhood nickname that was given to him by his family, who were mostly made up of pastors and clergy, was Little Preacher, because he was so devout and zealous about his Christian faith.